100% correct. What's happening is disgraceful.
President-elect Trump saying he'll stand by his plan for extreme vetting of people trying to come into the U.S. from countries with a history of terrorism. That after a series of attacks this week in Europe. And it's time now for our Sunday Group syndicated columnist, George Will, Gerald Seib, the Wall Street Journal's Washington bureau chief, Julie Pace, who covers the White House and the transition for the Associated Press, and the co-founder of the web magazine The Federalist, Ben Domenech. Ben, let's start with the president-elect's comments late this week about let's have a new arms race with Russia, flying in the face of a half-century of arms control and doing it, as Newt Gingrich said, in 140 characters. Your thoughts about the policy and the way of conducting it?
Well, I think that, certainly this is one of the early days of experiencing what foreign policy discussions are going to be like under the Trump presidency, which I think are going to be very different than they have been in the past under a lot of other presidents. I think that one of the things we're going to have to get used to is the idea that when Donald Trump tweets something, it's going to be followed up by explanations of what he actually meant within those 140 characters by his supporters. I think in this case, when it comes to modernizing our nuclear program and understanding our position vis-a-vis Russia, this does send a message that things are not going to be necessarily all fine and dandy when it comes to our relationship with Putin or with other world leaders. I think the more important and interesting part of the discussion is another thing that you brought up in your conversation with the former speaker, which is what is our policy going to be as it relates to these continued terror attacks that we've seen play out over the past week. We have a situation now in Europe where you had an individual who was on all of the necessary watch lists, who was tagged as being someone who is dangerous, who had dealt with a car robbery in Tunisia, a deportation issue when it came to Italy, a terror probe when it came to Germany. These are all situations that should have had this individual much higher on the appreciation of our European allies as someone who resembled a threat. I think the more interesting and challenging question going forward is what Trump's policy is going to be towards situations like that, not just in Europe, but here as well.
Jerry, on both nuclear arms and also on the war on terror, when you see what Trump has been saying, when you see the team he's putting together on national security, do you see the outlines of a strategy, of a foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think you have to view what President-elect Trump is doing as signal sending, not policy making. I mean, this is signal sending and positioning, and it's not really literal policy. On the nuclear question, for example, totally lost in the conversation is the fact there's already underway a $1 trillion 30-year nuclear modernization program that the Republicans in Congress and President Obama agreed to a couple of years ago. So this is happening. I think what he is saying is not, I'm creating some new policy on nuclear arms, but I'm sending a signal to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the Iranians, to the North Koreans. We're not going to fall behind in any nuclear arms race if there's going to be one. So I think people tend, there was this rap in the campaign, don't take him too literally. I think there's still an admonition out there, don't take him too literally.
Do you agree with that, George? Don't take him too literally?
Well, it's hard to know what he's said so far, because he says it's going to expand and improve. We all know that nuclear weapons decay. They age and have to be brought up to date again. So as Jerry says, this is already baked in the policies, $108 billion to be
But not the expansion part. The idea of modernization is, but when he talks about expansion and then he says, we're ready for an arms race, that's different than what we've heard.
That is very different. And in fact, that's what's alarming. It could be. Things change. 40 years ago, we had this policy. Maybe now with new nuclear actors, it ought to be changed. But what's a little bit disconcerting is what Mr. Gingrich considers a virtue, which is that it's done in 140 characters. If we're going to change national policy on the most awesome and frightening aspect of national existence, these kinds of weapons, then it would be nice to see it issue after deliberation with people who've thought about this for a long time, rather than as what seems to have been a response to something a few hours earlier said by Mr. Putin.
George, I want to continue with you about President Obama and his moves this week to ban oil drilling on millions of acres in the Arctic and the Atlantic, and very serious talk about transferring as many as 18 prisoners out of Guantanamo. We ask you for questions for the panel, and here's what we got from Monica Neese on Facebook. What is Obama's thinking Obama's thinking after the American people clearly rejected his failed policies by continuing with his agenda in his last days in office? George, how do you answer Monica?
Well, first about Gitmo, that must be one of his principal frustrations, because this is a limit of presidential power where presidential power is presumptively at its greatest, connecting to national security. There were 780 people in Gitmo, I think, by George W. Bush. It's now down to 59. This would reduce it to 42. That's not closed, but it's close enough for government work. Drilling, the president likes, and his party likes, to remove fossil fuels from the hand of consumers, and they like to expand government's control over things, such as the Outer Continental Shelf, so it all fits. Monica's question, however, is why is he still doing this? Short answer, he's still president, even though Mr. Trump seems to question that at this point, because he's, I think, exercising power, not just signaling. But first of all, the progressive view of the presidency is that what is not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution is permitted. That's from Teddy Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson on. They believe that. And Monica says, well, what about the consent that was sort of withdrawn by the election? Good progressives don't take consent that seriously, because progressivism is ruled by experts who are needed because the people consenting to the political class don't quite know what they're doing without the guidance of experts.
I got to say, Monica, you got a heck of an answer from George. Well, that was an extended answer. Julie, what is the mood in the Obama administration at this point? How worried are they that, to use a phrase I used with Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, he's going to take a wrecking ball to the Obama legacy? And to what degree do they think with these steps at the last minute they can lock in some of that legacy?
Well, they're incredibly worried, which is why they're taking some of these steps right now. And with most of the things that you're seeing the president do over the last few weeks, he can't lock things in permanently, but he can make them harder for President Trump to remove. And I think that's what you're seeing. Create enough obstacles that it becomes just too difficult to focus on overturning the drilling ordinances and push him in a different direction. But on some of these things, Gitmo, I think, is a really interesting example. Basically, what he's trying to do is say there are so few people that are going to be left here that the costs will be so high that Republicans and President Trump, who's talked about waste in government spending, may actually decide to close it. He's looking for ways to make his legacy stand up, even if President Trump isn't going to say, yeah, I'm keeping Obama's policies.
I just want to pick up on this question of the mood. I mean, is the sense, whether it's the president or his top aides, is there a feeling there that the barbarians are at the gate and about to take over?
I think there's a division between some people in the staff and Obama himself and maybe some of his more senior advisors. Certainly, I think that they are still, at the staff level, still coming to grips with this idea that there was such a rejection of the president's legacy and that so many things that they've been working on are probably going to be at stake. The president himself is taking a bit of a more measured view of this. He's in conversation with President-elect Trump a lot, trying to explain the theories behind some of his actions. And I think that he hopes, we don't know if this will hold, but he hopes that when Trump actually gets in office.
He keeps saying that he's going to have a transformation.
And I don't know if transformation is the right word, but certainly you would imagine that when you actually are in the Oval Office and all of these decisions really are on your desk, that there's more of a sense of responsibility that comes over you.
Ben, 30 seconds.
John Adams said that you would never congratulate a friend on winning the office of the presidency. I think that could be playing into this a bit. But really, I think this is what's going on in the left right now is an archetype of what happened to Ivanka Trump this past week. Someone yelling at her on a plane that, you know, your father is ruining the country. He hasn't even taken office yet. He hasn't done anything yet. I think the left is still dealing with whiplash from this election, and a lot of the people who are under President Obama haven't woken up.
Let me incidentally say that was the height of bad manners, and I'm glad those guys got kicked off the plane. Absolutely. You know what? Somebody's traveling on a plane, leave them alone.
Exactly.
All right, we have to take a break here. We'll see you a little later, panel.